And now we'll start the Renaissance. So, basically, Renaissance is the rebirth. But as I sort of started touching on uh, during the Carolingian period with Charlemagne, scholars are really starting to think that during that time period is when all this stuff really started to happen in Europe. As I talked about, more bigger, stable kingdoms, all that led to the Gothic period. Uh, as I say, that's like, that's adding wood to the fire. So the Renaissance is when the water finally boils. Before, I always remember, the Renaissance was like people just woke up in the late 15th and 16th century, and that's like everything changed all of a sudden overnight. It's like all of a sudden everything was just totally different and new. Um, but really, like I said, this is when the pot really starts to boil. This is finally when everything happens. And of course, Italy, where we will start off with the early Renaissance and the High Renaissance. And of course, Italy's sticking out in the Mediterranean, so all the trade routes and all of that, they're going through Italy. Italy becomes, the first major sort of stopping point along the way, the gateway to the rest of Europe. So we have that, more trade that takes place. The dominant, stronger kingdoms continuing. One of the other things that happens is, one of the first massive reformations within the church, where no longer is there the worry of salvation and the need for all the pilgrimages, although there's still some of the pilgrimages uh, to go see the saints and things like that. Um, that starts to take a back seat, uh, you could say. Uh, there's not as much emphasis on the saints like there was before. Uh, and with, the stuff that the uh, the Islamic cultures were introducing, into mainland Europe, suddenly looking back at the past civilizations like Greece and Rome, that becomes acceptable. The accepting of the philosophies and things like that. After thousands of years, Christians finally figure out that it's okay. Well, I guess maybe not thousands of years, but hundreds of years. That stuff from the Greeks and all of that is it's okay. It's okay to work that into things. So I know it fast forwards a little bit, but I always like to start off with Raphael's School of Athens. And as you can see, massive fresco that he did for the Pope for they're at it, making some changes, some remodeling. The Pope's new office, basically. So he wanted to have the School of Athens, although not everyone in the image is from Athens. Athens is sort of a blanket statement for classical Greece. Uh, so if I was to ask you to start naming uh, people from classic Greece, the classic periods, Plato, Socrates, uh, all those all those names. Hypersia, the female mathematicians up in there. Uh, if any of the kind of big Greek names you could think of, they're in there. One sort of funny thing is, one person who is not an Athenian, not from Athens at all. In fact, the particular person Raphael decided to include in this painting was a fellow artist. He had already had a bit of notoriety, a little bit of fame, and so Raphael really looked up to this painter artist, since he did more than just painting. So they're kind of in the middle, leaning on the little table there is none other than Michelangelo. It was said that Raphael would kind of stall and waste time, make sure Michelangelo left for the day, then he would run off into the Sistine Chapel and climb up on the scaffolding and just stand there at awe. How his figures were so full of life and had all this energy to them, so that he felt that Michelangelo should be up there with the great masters of Athens. So starting with the early Renaissance, Masaccio and Donatello. So Masaccio, the Holy Trinity, part of a tomb in the church. And here we have an image of Jesus. And one of my trivia questions I would normally ask in class was, who is someone that is being portrayed here in this image that has never been seen before? That is, of course, an image of God. Now that they've gotten rid of the cult of saints, more or less, God starts to be portrayed as, he's down here on earth, he's amongst us, he knows us, he hears you, you don't need the middleman anymore. Essentially is, what starts to take place with the Christian doctrine. And of course the artists echo these ideas and changes that start to happen. And of course we all know that when Jesus was crucified, it was in a hallway, but not really. Again, it's Masaccio adding this architectural element so that it's familiar. So kind of like, if you remember the Duccio and the Giotto images, much more natural settings, much more familiar settings with the Duccio. Masaccio is kind of doing the same thing here, creating this familiar setting so that the crucifixion's not this far off event. It's something that could have happened here. And one of the other notable things about Masaccio is he's given credit as one of the first European artists to start to use linear perspective. So he's creating that sense of depth in his painting. That it's not just this flat surface, but there's the depth to this sort of architectural feature. There's depth to this hallway that would be understanding that there's sort of the foreground, middle ground, background that we talked about going on in his image. And then Donatello made a sculpture of David. Because we've seen sculptures, but this one's in bronze. So that kind of becomes the big deal. Basically, if you think about it, for like 1,000 years or so, bronze casting in Europe was not done. That was part of the technology that was lost, essentially, during the Dark Ages, and it gets reintroduced from the Islamic cultures. And so Donatello taking advantage of being able to cast in bronze for his work. And then we have the Birth of Venus by Botticelli, or sometimes referred to as Venus on the Half Shell. And so here we have Venus there coming out of the water. And we have a maiden there about to kind of put this gown or robe on her, and there's the other godly beings that are help blowing life into Venus for her birth. So if you remember, who was Venus? What was she used for? What was her purpose? Well, she was the goddess of love. And how was she being born? She's coming up out of the water. And then, the next question would be, well, what is a water sign of? What can water stand for? Cleanliness and purity. So essentially, this is a goddess that was a pure soul, and her purpose was, two people in love. They want things to work out. They want their happily ever after. They would, go pray, make an offering to Venus. So if you start to think about the idea of a pagan goddess being painted, that's kind of crazy. But like I said, things from Greece and Rome start to become a little more acceptable, not so considered as heresy. So, Botticelli's trying to think of, well, how can I do this and not have to light the courtyard at night? Meaning he's not being burned at the stake. So, how do I make this Venus acceptable? How do I make it to where it's not so far-fetched? Well, okay, let's think about Venus again. The goddess of love. People want things to work out. They pray to her, make an offering. Pure, clean birth. Does that maybe ring a bell to some? Since we're dealing with Christian Europe still, who in Christianity does that kind of sound familiar to you? So essentially, it's almost the same story of Mary. Mary was a clean birth. Mary was born without sin. When two people were in love and they had the whole cult of saints and all that, they would pray to Mary for their happily ever after. So essentially, Venus is not only creating this image of a pagan goddess, with a similar background story, similar sort of function in the given religion, but even, making some similar appearances, like that sort of kind of dazed, lost look, that tilt of the head. Somewhere along the way, someone decided, this is what Mary looks like. She always had the sort of tilt of her head. So that's, you can find all these, hundred thousands of images of Mary sort of portrayed in this way. And so Botticelli, making making that point with Venus, so that there's these similarities, and it's not so far-fetched to have this image of a pagan goddess. And then so getting into the High Renaissance is where I say is the greatest joke on humanity, where artists become a genius. Some of y'all probably question that one a little bit. But essentially before this time, artists were no different than any other skilled laborer. So there would be no difference between a blacksmith's workshop or a stonemason, an artist. They would be all the same kind of thing. And typically, while some artists started to get a little bit of notoriety, they were just sort of paid as this collective group. So it was during the High Renaissance where Giorgio Vasari writes a book about all the top painters and sculptors and architects of the time. And so that's where you get the separation between, seeing Leonardo and all that he's known for, Michelangelo. That's when they start to achieve this rock star status. And so that it's no longer just the skilled trade, but it's these people are geniuses. And you get into the idea of the Renaissance man, and the Renaissance man is someone that kind of can do a little of everything. So I always like to compare that with Leonardo da Vinci. What all can Leonardo da Vinci do? What all has he done that you could think of? I guess the better question would be, what has Leonardo not done? So one of his paintings, of course, we looked at the Mona Lisa before, and briefly talking about it, making fun of it, where I threw this atmospheric perspective in the background, the sfumato, say that one 3 times real quick, and the chiaroscuro, the sfumato, the atmospheric background. As things get further into the background, they get lighter and lighter, kind of disappear. Chiaroscuro is the lights and the darks of an image, so that he's modeling the image so that it is this believable 3D shape. You're looking at this believable 3D world, even though it's a flat canvas. As well as Leonardo, very popular for this triangular composition. When we talked about the implied shapes and implied lines, Leonardo basically, just, you could draw this triangle or pyramid around most of his subject matters in his paintings. And then next, looking at Michelangelo and his sculpture, David. So he did sculpture, architecture. So the St. Peter's Basilica that we see today is, well, the church itself is his design. There, other architects added their little touch, their little flair to it. But for the most part, the main structure itself is from Michelangelo. The dome is the only thing not original to his, simply because during this time, Florence and Rome were kind of the two superpowers. Florence at this time was essentially a republic. They kind of bragged that they didn't have a king or anything like that. Like the whole idea of ancient Rome. They were just, this commercial powerhouse, wealthy through trade and commerce. Whereas in Rome, the Vatican, in the city of Rome, and that's the Papal States, basically the Pope, the Catholic Church, they kind of ran everything down there. So they had, the big bragging rights of, well, we're the world headquarters of the Catholic Church, therefore we're superior, we're better. And so when Florence, who started their cathedral construction a little before the Vatican, although the Vatican came along, finished theirs before Florence. Florence finally got theirs finished, and then it became kind of a question of, on these two cathedrals, of which one had a higher dome. And it turned out Florence's dome was like 2 or 3 feet higher. So, Vatican, they're like freaking out, so they had to add a little bit of extra stuff onto the dome so that they could claim higher. And so Michelangelo's David sculpted when he was 23, and David looks kind of funny in a way. If you really start examining his proportion, he has kind of these long gangly arms and kind of a big fat head. Why would Michelangelo do that? Why make David so funny looking? Well, David was originally supposed to go up on top of Florence Cathedral, but all the other artists of the time backed out. Michelangelo was the only one that finished his in time. And when the Florentines saw it, when Michelangelo dropped it off, they couldn't bring it to putting it way up there on top of the cathedral. So basically what Michelangelo did was reverse the proportions in a way by having a bigger upper body. If you're standing on the ground looking up, his body would not, recede, get smaller, and have this little, T-Rex arms and a pea head. By reversing the proportions, you're standing on the ground looking up, it would have the appearance of someone that's standing right in front of you. Everything would be in its proper proportion. So the other thing that he is known for, of course, is the frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. Fun fact, Michelangelo hated painting. He thought painting was the lowest of all the art forms. But he would say he had to do it because he was this destitute, poor person when, actuality he was like a millionaire in his time. And of course, this is when the ceiling was the first set of frescoes that he did. Then the far wall back there behind the altar, the last thing that he painted in the Sistine Chapel. The other walls painted by various other artists. So the ceiling and the far walls what we'll be looking at. Of course, the ceiling is about the book of Genesis. So if you remember, we touched a little bit on when talking about the canons of proportions, the golden means, and all that. There's the root 5 rectangle. That's, you start playing with all the math and all that, you end up with the root 5 rectangle, and that's what these, I refer to them as panels on the ceiling. They're based on the root 5 rectangle. Plus Michelangelo would be looking at the canons of proportion from the ancient Greeks as well as some of the Roman stuff for his anatomy work. So here we have, creation of Adam. Again, we have God, this, old, wise, philosopher-looking person. And then there's Adam sitting there at his creation. And looking at the far wall, we have Christ in Judgment. So the last painting that Michelangelo did in the Sistine Chapel is the Book of Revelations. So here we have, we have Jesus here in judgment. And so when you get into Christian iconography, if you're by the right hand or left hand, or are you by the hand of judgment, or are you on the hand of forgiveness? That was kind of an important thing if you were portrayed in a piece like that, if you were on the right or left. And of course, kind of the middle section where you get into purgatory and things like that. And down there at the bottom is where you have the devil or one of his little little henchmen. They're basically beating these souls into hell with the paddle. So funny thing, when they were doing this massive restoration, it's been a couple of decades since they started it, and they've finished it by now. So they're doing this massive restoration of the Sistine Chapel, and they basically start at one end, work their way to the other. So the last thing that they were cleaning, getting all the grime and the muck off, because back when they had candles and oil lamps burning inside here to light the chapel, it's getting soot and all kinds of nasty stuff all over these frescoes. So they're getting all that off. So they make a discovery, and they notice that certain parts of the fresco are not original, that this has been had some work done on it. So essentially, they figured out that there is a lot of censoring that's going on. A lot of loincloths and fig leaves and cover-ups and things like that, where when Michelangelo originally painted it, everyone was pretty much nude, but there was a pope along the way that was not too thrilled with that, so they decided to cover it up. Then the question became, well, do we want to get back to the Michelangelo? And if we want to get back to the Michelangelo, how do we remove this thin layer of plaster off the plaster and not ruin anything? Well, you couldn't really do that. So they just decided to leave it as it is, not mess with it, and try to get back to the original Michelangelo, because they figured that might do more damage than we want to deal with. So basically, someone's getting in on the list of artists in the Vatican collection. And so our last hero on the half shell, Raphael. Raphael was just a painter. He did not really dabble in other disciplines like Leonardo and Michelangelo did. So here we have Pope Leo X with the two cardinals. How does the Pope appear? First, when you think of the Pope, what do you think of? Well, you probably think of the big crazy mitre hats and the staff of St. Peter's and all the big fancy vestments and gowns and things like that. But we don't really get that here. We have Pope Leo sitting at a desk with his Bible. Next to that is the papal seal, he would use for signing documents. A little wax seals attached to everything, so they know is official from the Pope. Basically, we have Pope Leo in his everyday sort of lounge wear. Same with the cardinals. They're sort of dressed down. Uh, and so really it's kind of this idea that Pope Leo did not want to be remembered as this great grand person. He wanted to be remembered as, just another person. Sure, I hold this high majestic office, uh, I'm leading the Catholic Church, but I was put here by a vote. I don't have this divine right. I was lucky enough to be voted into this position. I'm lucky enough to hold this position. Basically, I'm flesh and blood like everyone else. So they're taking all these people off these massive high thrones and pedestals and making them everyday people like you and me. So that he doesn't want to, he just wants to be remembered for someone that was, basically for him, being a good Christian as his Bible and all that. He's just a leader of the church. He doesn't want all the pomp and circumstance and the notoriety. He's just, I'm flesh and blood. I'm human like everyone else. How he wants to be portrayed here. So that's basically what Raphael's doing, is taking him off that pedestal and just putting him in his office chair. But then Titian, as we kind of move along, and especially when we get into mannerism, the tail end of the Renaissance, you start to get a little more dramatic feel. You start to get darker backgrounds, more use of chiaroscuro in these darker areas, a little more dramatic as dramatic lighting starts to take place. A little more energy and feeling that Titian is bringing in with the Annunciation. So we have, Mary sitting there, the angel Gabriel, telling Mary what's about to happen. Here we have the dove, kind of flying down between the little cherub angel winged baby things, coming down to impregnate Mary, basically. So this is making it a little more, a little more dramatic, a little more kind of a heightened feel to it. Again, when you think about the accuracy, again, putting Mary in a little more contemporary setting, of 1560, and her wear, her clothes she's wearing, and some of the background details, kind of the architectural elements that we see. These are all things that you would be familiar with. So again, it's making her familiar.